Ranu Jung is a professor and department head in biomedical engineering at Florida International University. Her main research interests are in neural engineering and computational neuroscience. She's also the director of the Adaptive Neural Systems Lab at the university and has been involved in many research projects and developed amazing devices that have helped many people. We're very excited to have the chance to talk to her about all of this and more. Professor Jung, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to talk to all of you, your Langley Grammar School, your particular biological society that has been so proactive, reached out, and let's go on.
So I think the best place to start would be to find out what first got you interested in science and technology.
You know, when I think you had asked me this question in the email that you had sent me, and I started to think about what got me excited or thinking about it. I think it's probably my parents who were walking me around as a toddler and saying, watch this, look at this, and look at that nature. Because I remember being a young kid and asking why is this happening? Why is that happening? And so perhaps that curiosity about things around me, things around nature, that's what got me started.
So were your parents very science involved?
Yes and no. My father's an engineer, but my mother's was an English teacher. And so it was two different sides of things. But I grew up in India, and I grew up in the city called Bhilai, and Bhilai was a new industrial city after post-independence. The industrialization was happening, and so a new city was brought up basically for the steel industry. And so I think part of that was that everybody was determined. There's like a pioneering spirit amongst my parents' group, and they were all trying to build the whole place. So science was kind of built in, but also this drive to kind of explore and not be afraid of starting something new. So I think that kind of rubbed down to all the kids, you know.
So what made you interested in biomedical engineering specifically as something you wanted to study?
So I think perhaps like all of you, some of you may be confused. Do I want to do medicine? Do I want to do engineering? And so I was one of those confused kids who didn't know what to do, medicine or engineering. I chose engineering and I went into electronics and communications. But all the time I had this kind of medicine thing and what's going on with the body question. And then I discovered through actually an undergraduate research opportunity in a lab that there is a field called biomedical engineering, and that in the United States, there are degree programs at the graduate level where you can explore both. And so then it was like, oh, I found the thing that I wanted to merge and go forward with. And that's how I got into, quote, biomedical engineering, you know.
And so how come you chose to study at Case Western Reserve University specifically?
So Case is, as I mentioned, you know, biomedical engineering wasn't there in many places. So it was only in some places, not others. Case is one of the old, very established programs in this field. And you might have also heard of Cleveland Clinic, where a lot of work being done with the heart. So I knew about that. I read about that, and I read about the program there. And I thought, okay, this seems like a place that would be a great opportunity to have, and I really was very lucky that I was accepted into their doctoral program, and that's how I left India and came here as a graduate student.
So originally you're from India, and was the move from India to the US challenging?
So in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no, because one thing that happened in India was that, well, first of all, because of the Britishers for a long time. So there's already a certain influence of being, of knowing other cultures, other countries, and all of that. And language was not a barrier, so that is not an issue. And in another way, as growing up there, you always looked up to say, oh, this is going on in the US, this is going on there. So you kind of had that kind of a data collection, so to speak, through different ways that you didn't. There was no internet to talk about. So, but from other friends or family members. And so in that sense, it wasn't like, you're just stepping into completely something different. And on the other hand, you come to a new country and it is different. And so, so there are things that are different, but people are, it's amazingly similar in what they are actually underneath. So you have the same issues and same conversations in many different ways. So in some ways it was difficult, and in some ways it wasn't.
And I was wondering if you could describe the kind of work you do at the Adaptive Neural Systems Lab.
So the lab, so I'm part of the Biomedical Engineering department. So we've got different aspects about research. So we really have three pillars. We have got neurosciences, we have neural engineering, and kind of rehab. So we work kind of at the intersection of all of those. And what is driven that why that I told you about a few minutes ago is that investigation, the curiosity of what is going on with the body. And in particular, we want to know about the nervous system in health, or nervous system in disease, or nervous system after trauma. So one aspect is understanding that. Another is saying if we understand it and there is some gap, then how do we intervene or do some kind of a repair? And then the holy grail is, could we do with our intervention something that will effectively repair the system for after you have taken away that technology or taken away that intervention? So recovery in the long run. So we're interested very specifically in lately, at least in the past 8-10 years, a lot about being able to develop neurotechnology in order to promote recovery of lost function to trauma. And so a lot of the projects have been around there. But it really spans all the way from idea, concept, to the hope is that whatever we have come up with can be delivered into the clinic. So looking at the whole pathway. So different students are working at different parts of that pathway, because one single person may not be able to do all of it. But even if you are doing basic science investigation, you are driven by what is happening, what is the clinical need. So that is driving the basic science part, and then it is moving back forwards. And those who are doing technology development should not just be making gizmos. They should be understanding both the clinical need and also understanding what may be the mechanisms that may be influencing the design of these, and also when you use these devices, how you might influence the body itself all the way down to the cellular level. So it's this continuum that you need to think about.
Wow.
So long answer, not a very short answer. I would fail in that debate. So.
As you said, that you were recently involved in developing a pretty groundbreaking device, a wireless implant that allows amputees to feel the sensation of touch through a prosthetic. And although I know the systems are probably very complicated, could you explain kind of briefly how it works and how you went about creating it?
Sure. So first I have to say that I has to be replaced by we. It's not I, it is a whole team. It's a whole group of people who have made this possible, and different partnerships between academics, industry members, and clinicians, all three together. So let me explain what it is. So when you reach out and touch something or hold something, you don't have to look at it, and you can hold a soft cup, and you may have coffee, but you shouldn't squeeze it very hard. But if somebody who has an amputation and they're using a prosthetic hand, when they reach out to touch something or hold something or grasp something, they really have to almost look at it. They may be a super user and they can contract the muscles that are left over above the level of the amputation, and you can pick up these electromyograms or signals from there that control the prosthesis. This is available commercially, but most of the time they have to look at it. So what the whole goal of the project is, can we restore the sense of touch and grip force to somebody who has lost it because they have an acquired amputation for whatever, usually a traumatic reason. So how can you go about it? So one of the things you can do is to say, well, you've lost the arm, but above the level where the amputation is, those nerves are still okay. So if we were to be able to say, hey, those nerves would have picked signals from the natural sensors in your hands. If we could have replaced that by somehow stimulating those nerves, then could we restore sensation to the person? And so this concept has actually had been done before, and we knew that yes, you could stimulate the residual nerves and the person would be able to perceive things. The question was, are they going to be able to perceive multiple things, and how do we come up with a system that they could take home, not just sit in the lab? So we said, well, the system must be implantable. It should have you should be able to wear it easily, take it off easily. It should be no different than them wearing their other prosthetic hand. So the system is a prosthetic hand with sensors embedded in it, which tell you force and hand opening. That information is processed in external electronics to make sense of it. And then based on the level of the touch or grasp, we send commands to a neurostimulator that is implanted inside the arm through a wireless link, a radio frequency of wireless link. And what does the neurostimulator do? The neurostimulator has very fine wires, as thin as human hair, that target inside the nerves to give you very targeted focal activity. And when you pass these commands, the commands are basically telling to the neurostimulator what kind of pulse frequency with which you should stimulate, what should be the intensity of stimulation. And so electrical charge is going to be delivered right next to the nerve fibers. So when that happens, the nerve fibers get activated. Now when they get activated, they go, the nerve goes to the spinal cord, then you go to the brain, and the person perceives something. It so happens that the person perceives, sometimes they may feel like a tingling, or they may be able to feel pressure, but they are able to feel things as though they are coming from the prosthetic hand itself or the phantom hand. So if you have no prosthetic hand, it feels to them like it's coming from this phantom hand. When the prosthetic hand is there, it's almost like the two have merged together. And so basically it's like a pacemaker that is driven by an external signal, and that external signal is some kind of a map between the sensory information and the stimulation level. So now this person has been implanted. We have done one person now. It's an investigational device. We have done one person, and that person has had the system for 3 years. And so besides doing things in the lab, they could take it home because it is designed to be able to be taken home. And if you were to look at him, you wouldn't know that he has an implant, just like you wouldn't know somebody has a pacemaker in there. But when he wears his prosthetic hand, he has a little antenna on the outside that he places in parallel to the antenna of the neurostimulator implant. There's a magnet on the outside and a magnet on the inside that holds it across the skin. And then he goes about, turns it on, and he can goes about using it.
Wow.
So
that's pretty amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
I think the beauty to me, so this is technology development, but I think the biggest beauty to me is how does the brain, because you basically have put the brain in the loop, the person in the loop. And so yes, you are stimulating something. So we don't stimulate everything, obviously, like what we may get from biological sensors. But I like to say, when you read, you don't read every letter. You read a word, you skip words, and you still make sense. So somehow, with just sparse information that is really being given in this stimulation, the person is able to feel things in that way. So how does the brain interpret all of it? How many sensory pieces of information it will be able to interpret simultaneously? There are many open questions about that. We know they can do at least 2 because they can say hard and soft with their eyes are closed, and you can put the prosthetic hand far away and just do the stim and can distinguish those with the sensation. But what if we had 5 different things and all the fingers had sensors, and there were many, multi-articulating hands with sensors, and something was soft and something was hard? Would this person be able to tell all that? We don't know. Those would be questions. So part of it was developing the technology, and now the technology gives us the opportunity to ask more questions, which are more science. It is the investigation there.
So in your research projects, you used mice and rats to test the experimental technology. So could you tell us how you used rodents in your research?
Yeah, so I think there is different ways depending on the project we do. There is a very important role that preclinical data collection has. If you are answering a scientific question, then sometimes there are things you would not be able to do in humans, and so we may use an animal model to understand that, or to do some investigations, and it may be an animal model for a disease, for example, and then you might be able to tease out mechanisms and questions that you cannot do in the would not be ethically okay right now to do with the human subjects. Of course, we as engineers are blessed that we use a lot of computational work. So we are doing a lot of computational work. We try to make computational models that would be as close as possible to even sometimes the animal system or the human system in order to use that first. In the case of technology development that has to go into humans, there may be first things like, for example, when we are implanting those wires inside the nerves of a human being, we have first worked out things of saying, what if we were implanting those into the nerves in a rodent? So if we are able to do, can we get it targeted? How well will it stay there? Will they be stable for over months? Is there biocompatibility of materials that you are putting in, so that there is no issue about the tissue interface with the material or with the wire itself? So these are different ways in which we might use an animal model. There's an investigation part. There is also ability to make sure that they assess the safety and efficacy of some of the technologies in the animal model before we go to a human subject. But there are things that you cannot do with that. For example, this percept. It's very difficult to say, how would you assess the percept in an animal model? And so at some point, that is why we have having taken into account all of the rules and regulations. So we had to go through, the U.S. has the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. So we had to go through a long process to get approval from them for for this to be classified as an investigational device to run a clinical trial. And then there are ethics boards, we call them institutional review boards, that must look at all of the aspects for it. And everybody has to be trained, etc., before we can do the human subject studies. Same goes true for even before you do the animal studies. Those are more at the university level. This implant kind of work is really you have to have FDA approval to even start the clinical trial. So does that answer your question, Mithur?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
So you briefly talked about kind of the ethical and legal challenges that are involved in using animals in these tests. But when you're doing these experiments, when you're like kind of making one of these products, it's usually for people who have some sort of damage to their system. So when you're conducting the tests on the animals, do you use healthy animals, or do you have to look for certain animals that already have some sort of damage?
So in many cases, you can start with healthy animals because it depends on the question. So for example, if the question is the coating material on your wire going to cause a tissue interaction? That does not, you do not need an amputation animal with an amputation to do that assessment. So you try to do the lowest, the minimum number of studies you need to do, the lowest animal model in the phylogeny that will serve your purpose. So and as many things as you might be able to design your study so that you can do multiple things and get multiple answers from one animal itself. So you don't, so you want to make those replicates fewer than larger, just to the amount that is required. Sometimes depends on if you're studying a disease, for example, then you would need an animal model that has those characteristics. So there are rodent models for hypertension, for diabetes. So there are different kinds of animal models that have been bred with those disease characteristics. Those are necessary. In drug studies, that is much more important there. And some of our device studies, it may be not as necessary to have exactly the same model because of other aspects that we are looking at. But depending on the animal size, like if it's a large pacemaker, you couldn't put it in a rat. So you may need to go to a sheep, or sometimes goat, or some large, or a pig, in which you have to put in the device that is actually going to be tested. And the devices that are put in have to be manufactured, even the ones that are put in the animals have to be manufactured to exactly the same standards and using the same procedures that you would do for human implant. So that's the kind of data that you would have to collect to be able to go to the FDA to say, yes, we have sufficient data to say this is not going to be a safety risk. Yes.
I think you mentioned this before, but were there any limitations during your research that you faced?
Limitations, I think limitations come at every step. There are many limitations that come. Sometimes limitation may be financial. You don't have funding to support the work itself. So at least in the United States, one of the ways we do it is we apply for grant funding. We have been funded through what is our National Institutes of Health, our Department of Defense, the different places that you apply for grant funding. It is peer reviewed. There's somebody else who's their review boards that are looking at it. That allows you to get certain amount of financial support to do that. Sometimes the limitations may be that, for example, we cannot, as academicians, we are not going to be able to fabricate the device that goes inside a human being. That will have to be done by a company, a medical device company that is got the appropriate manufacturing capabilities. That means you must have a lot of legal agreements with them. And so sometimes those can be limiting for some people, just because maybe they don't have the ability to set up those, or there may be some constraints that the parties cannot agree to. So there can be many some are little limitations, some are larger limitations. But I think, it's persistence and resilience and trying to find a solution. And you try to find a solution and so that all parties can agree to move forward. And then sometimes there are limitations because maybe technology just hasn't moved as far. And you have to do something new, and you have to come up with a completely new, innovative idea, and you yourself are not quite sure. You've gone along the path, and all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. And so now you have to dial back, and now you just lost time, and you're thinking, okay, this was not the right idea that we had. And so those could be the limitations. That's just the limitations of knowledge and knowledge creation. But it just motivates you to say, okay, we've got to solve this problem. How are we going to solve it? So.
Yeah, you mentioned the legal limitations, and I think sometimes those limitations are those things that mainly set the project and the research back from its full potential. So actually, I'm wondering, were there any legal limitations that could have made the project better?
Legal limitations that could have made it better? Well, I think some of the things that could make it better, and over time they have become, is some of the things, we were the first ones in our group to do this. So the structures were not all there. So templates were not all there. So discussions that we had, there may have been things that we were fretting over, which we could have said, no big deal. They want to do this, fine. They can go ahead and you can have it. It's not. And so there are things that we ourselves didn't know, things they didn't know how to deal with with academics doing some of these things, because it wasn't as common for that to happen. The FDA themselves, we are bringing to them certain things and saying, we want to do this in an academic setting, and they're used to getting that from maybe an industry setting. So those were the kinds of things that, you have to, now it would be shorter. And so I wish they were shorter at that time. And we had, what did they say? Hindsight is 2020,
So where does your inspiration come from when thinking of new research projects? Is it kind of like the necessity for something new or anything else?
I think very much we are driven by need, and to say what is the need. And so the need is not necessarily need of just a person, but need is also need for a solution to a wicked problem.
Yeah.
And so to me, I get challenged by those wicked problems. So then it's like, oh, so how are we going to do this? What are we going to do that? No, maybe we should think about this. Maybe we should borrow from somebody else. Nature is a great inspiration of how did this happen there? How are they doing it? And so just looking outside the traditional box, that I think personally, to me, that is what inspires me to think of solutions. And then I think a commitment, a passion, and I see that for all my team members, the students, the scientists, a certain passion that we want to make a difference. And sometimes we know how, and sometimes we know very specifically what difference. Sometimes we don't, and it is just a gut feeling that we want to make a difference. But our group with some of whom have been working for 10, 15, 20 years or so, as a group, we have decided that we want to make a difference in people's lives, especially for people that have had some kind of a traumatic event happen to them. So once that has happened, then we have said, all right, we're going to do science inquiry, we are going to do technologies, we are going to reach out to them. So we will try different kinds of things with that, So what is, like when I talk to the students, often the tendency is to come up with methods, but what you want to think is the work that you're doing, how significant it is, and what kind of impact does it have. So something may be very significant, you found something that is very significant, but it may really have not much impact. Something else may be a simple thing and it's not a new significant discovery, but it may have, if you apply it, it may have a major impact. So thinking about that and saying, how do I balance those? And how do I find innovative solutions that will be sustainable, that will grow, that will open the path for more inquiry, or give you, it's not a dead end. So thinking of that helps. And then you find solutions of saying, oh, I don't know how to do it. Well, then it's coming up with methods that may exist, or maybe you come up with a new method,
That's so interesting.
Yeah. So people talk about beds, bench to bedside. We very much talk about bedside to bench to bedside, and not anymore just to bedside with some of these technologies, because we must get them into, I'll call it a commercial sector, but some sector that it can go on to the larger population. So that's the goal ultimately, to get that out. For our group, not everybody is looking at all of that pathway, but over the years, our group is getting into that sector of saying, okay, we really want to close the loop and push it out of our labs, no more in our labs.
So science and technology has changed a lot in recent years. But from your experience right now, what are the skills that you would look for most in a student? Which ones are the things that you think would help us the most to progress science and technology even further?
So to me, I want to know that the student has passion and has curiosity. Within your lifetimes, it is pretty obvious, I think, to all of you, what is known today is going to be obsolete in a few years. We do not know what is coming. So to me, what a student should have is if they have curiosity, they have passion, and they have willingness to learn new things, then they will find ways of learning new knowledge. Because that knowledge your lifetime is much longer than how long each bits of knowledge lasts. So there'll be many cycles of knowledge change over your lifetime. So and there is no way to learn everything today for what it would be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. So that's what I would look for. Having said that, practical things, digital literacy, I will put that in a bigger sense. Communications, being able to communicate in the oral word, in the, in oral, written. So it's this, but also communication with others with empathy. So those are things that are necessary in all realms, even if whatever you might be doing. Even you have heard about even people designing AI. If you do not have the understanding of others and you don't have empathy for others, even software that you may design may not be the most appropriate software and may end up alienating groups of people that have to interact with that software. So being cognizant that you are not alone, you are a part of a network of humanity. And that, to me, that is important.
I'd love to know, because you're a woman who started off in a field of mostly men, what kind of advice you'd give to other girls like me who'd like a career in science or anything like that?
So I think, and each stage you go through different things. First is, build confidence in yourself. So and that is true not just for girls. It's true for girls or boys. It's for everybody. It's building that confidence in yourself and knowing that you're not just defined by others. You choose to respond to what others say to some extent. Now, of course, there are all kinds of situations with race, gender, all of the different things that happen. But you do have some power over your own trained self of how you respond to others. So that is one thing that I'd say that, and that's true for both girls and boys. And yes, as a person who may be a single person in a group, it sometimes happens to be women, fewer, but you may be a person of color who is in that situation. So you need to find allies and you need to find support structures, maybe from within, because not everybody is going to exclude you. So if you can find somebody who can be that ally within, you do that. And if not, you look for people outside and you look for inspiration wherever. I've never met a Marie Curie, but as a child, I could imagine that, right? So there is no reason why you cannot even look back to history and say, how did she do it? What did she do? It wasn't like there were hundreds of women there then. So not that it would directly translate, but you try to look at different situations and say, what could I learn from that situation? And try to put that into my life, and then use that as sometimes a support structure. But reach out, talk to others, and then build that inner strength, that reflection and inner strength.
Thank you.
Professor Jung, you briefly mentioned the different organizations you've worked with. I just out of curiosity, I just wanted to know which organizations have you worked with for this project, and possibly the ones that you've worked with before? So
most of my life has been actually my formal engagement has really been in academia. So, after my doctoral studies, I worked for a little time in a cardiology group, but then you can say it's differently. But then I worked as a postdoctoral fellow in the university, then as an assistant professor, associate professor, and so on. So this work started when this specific work started when I was at Arizona State University. I was faculty member there, and then I moved to Florida International University. And so those are the two primary places where this particular work has moved forward. My other, I've started a company before, but more importantly, it is partnerships. So you obviously cannot implant in a person unless you are licensed to do that, and that requires a surgeon or a medical team. So you need partnerships with them. So you build close relationships with them, even though we ourselves are training them. So we have worked out the procedures, and our group has worked with, you talked about animals, you also sometimes have to use cadavers to practice things out. And then we have done that, but you need the clinical partnerships. And the other is building very strong relationships with industry partners. And they could be everybody who has to make a small part for you, or it may be that you are using a software platform from some company on which you are going to build your thing, so you have to make partnerships with them. In our case, we are talking with different prosthetic hand manufacturers, because there was nothing like a sensorized hand that was available, so you needed somebody there. So we could have tried to make one ourselves, but then it wouldn't be a commercial. It's another whole pathway to make that commercial part, right? So we said we are going to leverage as many things as we can out of the commercial market, so that we don't have to reinvent those. So we don't make the prosthetic hands. We needed the sensors, so we work with that company to say, hey, this is what we want. This is the kind of, this is how much sense your sensors must be able to tell us this much force, etc., because that's what our studies say. When a person squeezes, this is the force that you should be able to detect, etc. And then most importantly, being able to make the implant itself. So those are partnerships that are built on trust, or built on, there has to be something for them, there has to be something for you, and there has to be, as again I said to you, people skills. That is not, I'm not doing anything for them technically. They're not necessarily doing things. They may or may not be doing things for you technically, but it is the ability to work with people, to communicate with people, and, so that's what it is. And then I have professional societies that I've worked with, and different organizations in that sense,
Yeah. And I guess I don't think you and your team are stopping there with just the arm. But are you hoping to kind of extend that and kind of start looking at the other parts of the body as well in the future, and possibly now as well?
Yes. So the first thing we were going to, right now the indication is somebody which has got an amputation below the elbow, right? So, but only on one side. So their other side is a sound hand. So the first group that we might look for is people who have lost both of their hands. And so that might be the first group. Then we might look at saying, okay, what if it wasn't here, but you had lost a little bit further up? So in many ways, things would be similar, but some of the surgical techniques may have to be modified for that. Then the next thing to think about is the lower limbs, and say, what happens if you have lost an ankle, or you have different aspects of your lower limbs? Those would be within the sensory motor part. A completely different aspect is that when you stimulate these peripheral nerves, there is data that suggests that maybe electrical stimulation can reduce pain. So could we use our system, which is very focused stimulation inside the nerves, to be able to reduce different kinds of pain? Same person, but phantom pain, or other pain things, so other nerves in the body. And that opens up this whole big realm of what is being called bioelectronic medicine. And so that's like, that's a huge space. Will we get to it? Maybe some of my grad students or somebody might get to it, they have a long ways to go forward. So maybe they would get to it. So those are different things. We are also looking at, we have also looked at, one of the doctoral students looked at saying, what if you were not implanted, but you were stimulating from the outside? So usually if you touch a battery, you will get a shock, right, on the skin itself, right? But we figured out a way, he worked on his doctoral work, is that you can provide stimulation in such a way that you feel as though things are coming from your finger, but they're not, because you didn't touch this, you really just did the stimulation, and you don't feel it on the surface. So now we have many ideas of what if you could feel things that were in your fingers. Think about playing those games, or a robot, a surgeon working with robotic things. And when they're manipulating, so now this is not somebody with an amputation, this is, you or me. But then when they use it, they feel as though things are coming from there. So then you can still stimulate them. So that's a non-invasive sensory way. So there's all these other parallel pathways that we're looking at. And then another doctoral student is going to look at what happens in the brain activity when this neurostimulation happens or when you're doing this activity, both for an acquired amputation, and what about people who are born with congenital limb loss? So, do they have the ability to perceive sensation if we were to give stimulation? So these are just like lots of curious questions. And one doctoral student, she's, a few years in, and she really wants to figure that out. So maybe we'll go that pathway. So there are many, many pathways that we are thinking about, and that's the exciting part, that there's no end to imagination. So.
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. Yeah, thank you for answering. Yeah. So you were saying about having, I think, multiple amputations on. Will that, and I'm coming here from the film theory, will that fry the or burn nerve impulses if it's too much, or is it all controlled?
I'm not sure I understand the question. You're saying if the amputation was higher, would it be different?
No, as in if there are multiple, and if there was like a overload as such.
We don't know. So I think what you're asking is, if we were to stimulate many different stimuli at the same time, would the person be able? We don't know how many things can, we don't know how many things somebody would say, oh, this is too much. It's like, I have sound and I have music and I have flashing lights, and that's I think that's what you mean, like, sensory overload, so to speak. So maybe there could be sensory overload. So right now, when you fit the person, we do a stimulation, and first we say, do you feel anything? And they say, oh yeah, we feel. So then we know that's the minimum charge we want to put in, right? And then it's like a radio station, right? You put it a little, dial it up, and you just say, I barely hear it. Okay, now I'm going to start changing the volume, and it's going to be louder and louder. And at some point you can say, nope, no more. So what we say is not to the screeching part, but earlier than that, we say, is this a comfortable level? So whatever they say is the comfortable level, and what they say is the minimum, we force our stimulation to only stimulate within that range. So that's part of the fitting process. So those of you who might be looking at AI methods, machine learning methods, so how can we automate this? We don't have an automated manner, but not just automate in just, but like in a smart algorithms that can fit that. And if over time you want it always louder, or now you want it always slower, maybe the smart algorithms can automatically change the range. So that's for one stimulation. But now what happens if you have 3 going on at the same time, or 5 going on at the same time? So those will be questions we are going to have to ask. What do we do? Can the person even say it? Or sometimes we ask them to do with their sound hand what they feel on their on the stimulation. We ask them to squeeze. For example, they're feeling like they're closing their hand on one hand, and we put sensors on the sound hand, and we say, okay, move your hand to what you think this phantom hand is doing, right? What you feel your phantom hand, and they will move the sound hand. But because we have put sensors that measure the distance between the thumb and the finger, we have a quantitative measurement. The person doesn't have to say, oh, it's small, it's this much or that much. They're doing a mirroring task. So if they think like they're holding with the grip force, they squeeze a force transducer with the other hand, and we have a quantitative measure to see, are they being able to do it or not. So when you have many of these, that will already be a question, what is it that we are going to measure? If you give 5 things, how are we going to assess it? So there comes another question, right? What is the best way to do it? And you may run some preliminary tests and say, all right, we need to do a combination of this and that and then figure it out. So I don't have an answer for it.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, it was just one of my
No,
thoughts.
but
Yeah.
that's a question for us too.
Yeah.
Like, what is possible?
Is there a software component to the arm as well?
Yes. So all of this. So there's a lot of software component. There's different parts of the software component. Forget about the control part because we're using that with the commercial system to control. So there is whatever they do there, right? But when you're picking up the sensors, those sensor information has to be processed. So we can do it in software, but then what we call firmware, we're downloading it into the hardware within this external electronics. But it's a download of some software thing, right? So there's a fitting map that has to come up. So that fitting map goes in there. And then now also when you're collecting the data, somebody has to collect the data. So we have to make all kinds of software to be able to collect the data, observe it, and analyze the data. So there's a whole another aspect. So we use Python, a lot of Python in all our software development work. And students do MATLAB and all too, but we extensively use Python in our software development work. But so there's different kinds of things, and then we all you want it. Right now all this testing fitting is being done in the lab, but if it's going to go into the clinic, you want the nurse practitioner or the prosthetist or the doctor as they go in, for them to look at a screen and say, okay, answer a few questions and yeah, you're fit with this system, right? That's where we have to get to, and maybe things go to the cloud and we collect the data from the cloud. So there is layers and layers that can happen with the computer science side or the AI side. So as you can see, it's a multi-dimensional. There's a space in it for everybody, from people who want to do surgery to people who want to do computer science kind of work to people who want to understand what's going with the neuroscience part. So the project itself gives really a team that has many many different levels of expertise, many different interests, all that comes together,
Yeah.
So I hope I've been inspirational to you all, and that you will follow your passions and you will, reach out to whichever path you go forward with. There is so much to do, and so many things
Definitely.
to ask that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I feel like we've learned a lot from listening to you. And you answered our questions really well, and yeah, it was a great opportunity to be able to talk to you.
So thank you for inviting me. It's my opportunity to be able to talk to you all too, and keep me posted on how things go on for you all with this program, but also your own lives. And who knows, maybe you will be one of the people, maybe a physician, an engineer or something working with the system we're working with. Who knows?